The empty valley where the Holloway homestead once stood continues to serve as a monument to one family's extraordinary struggle with genetic adversity and their ultimate sacrifice to the limitations of human hereditary compatibility with survival. Their story reminds us that behind every advance in genetic knowledge are real families whose experiences, however tragic, contribute to our understanding of the complex relationship between heredity, environment, and human survival. The rediscovery of the Holloway homestead in 1924 sparked intense interest from the emerging field of genetics research, as scientists recognized that the family's detailed records provided unprecedented documentation of hereditary disease progression in an isolated human population. The timing of this discovery coincided with revolutionary advances in genetic theory and the growing scientific understanding of how hereditary traits are transmitted between generations. Dr. Margaret Foster, one of the first geneticists to study the Holloway family records comprehensively, described their documentation as a genetic treasure trove that provides insights into hereditary disease mechanisms that would be impossible to obtain through any other means. Her analysis revealed that the family had inadvertently created one of the most detailed case studies of genetic inheritance ever compiled, documenting the effects of sustained inbreeding across multiple generations with scientific precision that exceeded most contemporary research. The genetic analysis of Holloway family records revealed patterns of hereditary disease transmission that challenged existing theories about genetic inheritance and provided crucial evidence for understanding how recessive genetic traits could combine to create previously unknown hereditary syndromes. The family's meticulous documentation of birth defects, developmental disabilities, and early deaths across multiple generations provided researchers with data that would have required decades of controlled research to accumulate through conventional means. Dr. Foster's research team identified at least 17 distinct genetic disorders that appeared to be present within the Holloway bloodline, many of which occurred in combinations that created complex medical conditions that had never been documented in medical literature. The team's analysis suggested that the family carried genetic variants that were extremely rare in the general population, but which had been concentrated through sustained inbreeding to create unprecedented levels of genetic disease. The most significant finding from the genetic analysis was the identification of what researchers termed compound genetic syndromes, conditions where multiple hereditary disorders occurred simultaneously within individual family members, creating medical challenges that exceeded the sum of their individual components. These compound syndromes appeared to be unique to populations that had experienced extreme genetic isolation and represented previously unknown forms of hereditary disease. Dr. Robert Kim's molecular genetic analysis of preserved biological samples from the Holloway homestead revealed that the family carried genetic mutations that were so rare that they had never been identified in other human populations. His research suggested that some of these mutations might have been created through the genetic stress of extreme inbreeding rather than being inherited from ancestral populations. The Holloway family appears to have pushed the boundaries of human genetic diversity to their absolute limits, Dr. Kim concluded in his comprehensive genetic study. Their isolation created conditions where extremely rare genetic variants could combine in ways that are essentially impossible in normal human populations, resulting in genetic conditions that represent the outer boundaries of human hereditary disease. The psychological analysis of Holloway family records provided equally significant insights into how families cope with extreme genetic challenges and the mental health effects of caring for multiple severely disabled relatives in complete isolation from outside support. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a specialist in family psychology who studied the Holloway records, found evidence of remarkable resilience and adaptation alongside predictable patterns of stress, depression, and caregiver burnout. Dr. Martinez's analysis revealed that Holloway family members had developed sophisticated psychological coping mechanisms that allowed them to maintain family functioning despite dealing with genetic challenges that would overwhelm most contemporary families, even with access to modern medical and social support systems. These coping mechanisms included specialized family roles, emotional support systems, and meaning-making frameworks that helped family members find purpose and hope despite their tragic circumstances. The Holloway family demonstrates both the remarkable capacity of human beings to adapt to extreme adversity and the ultimate limits of what any family can endure without outside support, Dr. Martinez concluded. Their psychological resilience was extraordinary, but it was ultimately insufficient to overcome the biological realities of their genetic situation. For Ozarks, the family's psychological adaptation strategies included the development of religious and philosophical frameworks that provided meaning and purpose for their suffering, specialized caregiving roles that distributed the burden of medical care among multiple family members, and social rituals that maintained family cohesion despite the stress of dealing with constant medical crises and early deaths. However, Dr. Martinez's analysis also documented the progressive psychological deterioration that occurred among family members as their genetic problems worsened and their isolation became more complete. Later family records show increasing evidence of depression, anxiety, and stress-related mental health problems that reflected the family's growing recognition that their situation was ultimately hopeless. The anthropological significance of the Holloway case extends beyond its genetic and medical implications to include insights into how isolated human populations develop adaptive strategies for survival under extreme conditions. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, an anthropologist who studied the family's social organization, found evidence of remarkable innovation in family structure and social roles that represented unique adaptations to their genetic challenges. Dr. Walsh's analysis revealed that the Holloway family had evolved social structures that were fundamentally different from typical 19th century American family patterns, with specialized roles and responsibilities that reflected their need to manage complex medical challenges while maintaining family survival in isolation. These adaptations included modified marriage patterns, alternative child-rearing practices, and resource allocation systems designed to maximize care for disabled family members. The Holloway family created a unique form of social organization that represented a direct adaptation to their genetic circumstances, Dr. Walsh explained. Their family structure evolved to prioritize caregiving and medical support over traditional economic and social functions, creating a society that was specifically designed to cope with extreme genetic challenges. The family's social innovations included the development of specialized knowledge systems for managing hereditary diseases, communication methods adapted for family members with sensory and cognitive disabilities, and decision-making processes that prioritized medical needs over other family concerns. These adaptations demonstrated remarkable human flexibility in responding to extreme biological challenges. However, Dr. Walsh's analysis also revealed the limitations of social adaptation when confronted with genetic problems that exceeded the biological capacity for human survival. Despite their innovative social structures and sophisticated caregiving systems, the Holloway family ultimately could not overcome the fundamental biological incompatibility between their genetic conditions and long-term survival. The medical anthropology of the Holloway case has provided insights into how families develop folk medical knowledge and treatment approaches when isolated from formal medical systems. The family's medical records document sophisticated understanding of disease management, pain relief, and disability care that was remarkable for individuals without formal medical training. Dr. Lisa Chen, a medical anthropologist who studied the Holloway family's healthcare practices, found evidence of innovative treatment approaches that were often more effective than contemporary medical practice in managing certain types of genetic disorders. The family had developed specialized techniques for managing seizures, treating chronic pain, and providing supportive care for severely disabled individuals that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of medical principles. The Holloway family created a comprehensive folk medical system that was specifically adapted to their unique genetic challenges, Dr. Chen reported. Their treatment approaches were often more humane and effective than the institutional medical care that was available during their era, demonstrating the potential for innovative medical practice to develop in isolation from formal medical systems. The family's medical innovations included herbal remedies derived from local plants, physical therapy techniques developed through trial and error, and palliative care approaches that prioritized comfort and quality of life over cure. These innovations represented practical solutions to medical challenges that exceeded the capabilities of contemporary medical practice. However, the family's medical knowledge was also limited by their isolation and lack of access to scientific medical research. Their understanding of genetics and hereditary disease was based on observation and folk beliefs rather than scientific knowledge, leading to treatment approaches that were sometimes ineffective or even harmful despite their good intentions. The environmental aspects of the Holloway case have attracted attention from researchers studying the relationship between geographic isolation and human health. The family's remote mountain location provided both protection from outside interference and exposure to environmental factors that may have influenced their genetic conditions and overall health status. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, an environmental health researcher who studied the Holloway homestead site, found evidence that the family's water supply contained elevated levels of heavy metals and other contaminants that could have contributed to their genetic problems or exacerbated existing hereditary conditions. Her analysis suggested that environmental toxins might have interacted with genetic vulnerabilities to create more severe health problems than would have occurred from genetic factors alone. The Holloway family's genetic problems were clearly hereditary in nature, but environmental factors at their homestead site may have intensified these problems and contributed to the severity of conditions observed in later generations, Dr. Hoffman concluded. The interaction between genetic vulnerability and environmental stress creates complex health challenges that exceed the sum of their individual components. The environmental analysis also revealed that the family's isolation had protected them from infectious diseases that were common in 19th century communities, but had also limited their access to nutritional resources that might have supported better health outcomes. The trade-offs between isolation and health access created additional challenges for a family already struggling with severe genetic problems. The preservation of Holloway family records and biological samples has enabled ongoing research into genetic diseases and has contributed to the development of modern genetic counseling approaches for families affected by hereditary disorders. The detailed documentation of genetic disease progression across multiple generations provides valuable data for understanding inheritance patterns and developing predictive models for genetic risk assessment. Contemporary genetic research has used Holloway family data to identify genetic markers associated with various hereditary conditions and to develop better understanding of how multiple genetic disorders interact within individual patients. This research has contributed to improved diagnostic capabilities and treatment approaches for families dealing with complex genetic challenges. Dr. Michael Roberts, a contemporary geneticist who continues to study Holloway family biological samples, reports that modern DNA analysis techniques have revealed previously undetected genetic variants that provide new insights into the mechanisms underlying hereditary disease. His research has identified specific genetic mutations that were responsible for some of the unique medical conditions observed in the Holloway family. The Holloway family continues to provide valuable insights into genetic disease mechanisms more than 150 years after their disappearance, Dr. Roberts explains. Modern analytical techniques allow us to understand their genetic conditions with precision that was impossible during their lifetime, and this understanding contributes to better treatment for contemporary families dealing with similar genetic challenges. The ethical implications of studying the Holloway family case have been addressed through careful attention to treating family members as individuals deserving respect and dignity rather than simply as subjects for scientific investigation. Researchers have developed protocols for studying historical cases of genetic disease that balance scientific value with ethical obligations to honor the memory and suffering of affected families. The contemporary relevance of the Holloway case extends beyond its historical significance to include ongoing concerns about genetic isolation and its effects on human populations. While modern transportation and communication systems have reduced the geographic isolation that affected the Holloway family, researchers have identified other forms of isolation that could create similar genetic challenges in contemporary populations. Dr. Sandra Kim, a population geneticist who studies isolated communities, has identified several contemporary populations that face genetic challenges similar to those documented in the Holloway case. These populations include isolated religious communities, geographically remote populations, and culturally isolated groups that maintain strict marriage patterns that limit genetic diversity. The genetic principles that affected the Holloway family continue to operate in contemporary populations, Dr. Kim explains. While the specific circumstances that created their extreme isolation are less common today, the fundamental relationship between genetic isolation and hereditary disease remains relevant for understanding and preventing genetic problems in vulnerable populations. The public health implications of the Holloway case have influenced the development of genetic screening programs and marriage counseling services designed to help individuals and families make informed decisions about reproduction when dealing with hereditary disease risks. The case has been cited in public health policy discussions about the importance of genetic diversity and the need for intervention programs to support isolated populations at risk for genetic problems. The educational value of the Holloway case for training medical professionals, genetic counselors, and public health workers has been recognized through its inclusion in curricula designed to teach about hereditary diseases, population genetics, and the social factors that influence genetic health. The case provides powerful examples of both human resilience and the limitations of individual adaptation when confronted with severe genetic challenges. Medical schools throughout the United States use the Holloway case as a teaching tool for helping students understand the complex interactions between genetics, environment, and social factors in determining health outcomes. The case demonstrates the importance of considering genetic factors in medical practice, while also emphasizing the human dimensions of genetic disease and the need for compassionate care for affected individuals and families. Dr. Amanda Richardson, who directs genetic counseling training at a major medical school, describes the Holloway case as an essential component of genetic counseling education because it demonstrates both the devastating effects of genetic isolation and the remarkable human capacity for adaptation and caregiving under extreme circumstances. The case has also been used in training programs for social workers and public health professionals who work with isolated or vulnerable populations that may be at risk for genetic problems. The Holloway family's experience provides insights into the importance of outreach and support services for populations that may be reluctant to seek outside assistance due to privacy concerns or cultural barriers. The international significance of the Holloway case has been recognized through its inclusion in comparative studies of genetic isolation effects in human populations worldwide. Researchers have identified similar cases in various countries and cultures, suggesting that the genetic principles documented in the Holloway case represent universal aspects of human population genetics rather than unique circumstances specific to 19th century America. Dr. Jean-Pierre Dubois, a French geneticist who has studied isolated populations in the Alps, reports finding genetic patterns similar to those documented in the Holloway case among mountain communities that experienced extended periods of geographic isolation. His research suggests that geographic isolation consistently leads to genetic problems when populations become too small to maintain genetic diversity. The Holloway case represents a pattern that we see repeatedly in isolated human populations throughout history, Dr. Dubois explains. The specific genetic conditions may vary according to the founding genetic makeup of each population, but the fundamental relationship between isolation and genetic deterioration appears to be universal. Similar studies conducted in Scotland, Norway, Japan, and other countries with geographically isolated populations have confirmed that sustained genetic isolation leads to predictable patterns of hereditary disease that mirror those documented in the Holloway case. These international comparisons have contributed to global understanding of population genetics and the factors that influence genetic health in small populations. The technological advances that have been applied to studying the Holloway case include sophisticated DNA analysis techniques, computer modeling of genetic inheritance patterns, and advanced archaeological methods for recovering and analyzing biological evidence from historical sites. These technological approaches have revealed new information about the family's genetic conditions and provided insights that were not available to earlier researchers. Recent DNA analysis using cutting-edge sequencing techniques has identified specific genetic variants responsible for many of the hereditary conditions that affected the Holloway family. This analysis has contributed to the development of genetic tests that can identify carriers of similar genetic variants in contemporary populations, enabling genetic counseling and family planning services that could prevent similar tragedies. Computer modeling of Holloway family genetic inheritance patterns has provided insights into how genetic diseases spread through isolated populations and has contributed to the development of predictive models that can estimate genetic risks in small populations. These models are used by geneticists and public health professionals to identify populations at risk and develop intervention strategies. The archaeological techniques used to study the Holloway homestead site have been refined through application to other historical sites where genetic isolation may have occurred. These techniques have enabled researchers to recover biological evidence from sites that are centuries old, expanding understanding of how genetic isolation has affected human populations throughout history. The cultural impact of the Holloway case has extended beyond scientific and medical communities to influence literature, film, and other forms of popular culture that explore themes of genetic inheritance, family tragedy, and human adaptation to extreme circumstances. The case has inspired numerous fictional works that examine the complex relationships between genetics, environment, and human destiny. However, cultural representations of the Holloway case have sometimes oversimplified or sensationalized the complex scientific and human dimensions of their experience, leading to misunderstandings about genetic disease and the factors that contribute to hereditary problems. Researchers have emphasized the importance of accurate representation of the case's scientific and human elements to preserve its educational and preventive value. The memorial aspects of the Holloway case have been addressed through efforts to preserve the homestead site and honor the memory of family members who suffered from genetic conditions that were beyond their control or contemporary medical understanding. The site has been designated as a historical landmark with educational materials that explain both the scientific significance of the case and the human tragedy that it represents. The Arkansas Department of Health has established educational programs that use the Holloway case to teach about genetic health and the importance of genetic counseling for families at risk for hereditary diseases. These programs emphasize both the scientific lessons learned from the case and the need for compassionate support for individuals and families dealing with genetic challenges. Local historical societies in Arkansas have worked to preserve oral histories and family traditions related to the Holloway case, recognizing that these cultural memories provide important context for understanding the social and community factors that influence the family's experience. These preservation efforts have revealed additional information about community attitudes toward genetic disease and the social isolation that affected families with hereditary problems. The continuing mystery surrounding the exact fate of the Holloway family has generated ongoing interest from historians, genealogists, and researchers who hope to discover additional evidence about their final years or the circumstances of their disappearance. While no conclusive evidence has been found regarding their ultimate destiny, periodic discoveries of artifacts or documents continue to provide new insights into their story. Recent genealogical research has identified potential descendants of Holloway family members who may have survived and relocated to other areas before the family's final disappearance. DNA analysis of individuals with family traditions suggesting Holloway ancestry has revealed genetic markers consistent with the hereditary conditions documented in the original family, suggesting that some genetic legacy of the family may have survived. The ongoing research into potential Holloway descendants has important implications for genetic counseling and medical care, as individuals carrying Holloway genetic variants may be at risk for hereditary conditions similar to those that affected the original family. Genetic counselors work with these individuals to provide information about their genetic risks and options for family planning and medical monitoring. The legal and ethical questions raised by research into potential Holloway descendants include issues of genetic privacy, informed consent for genetic testing, and the responsibilities of researchers who discover genetic information that may have medical implications for living individuals. These questions have contributed to the development of ethical guidelines for genetic research involving historical populations and their potential descendants. The policy implications of the Holloway case continue to influence discussions about genetic screening, marriage counseling, and public health interventions designed to prevent genetic problems in vulnerable populations. The case provides evidence for the importance of genetic diversity in human populations and the need for policies that support genetic health while respecting individual autonomy and cultural values. Contemporary genetic counseling programs often reference the Holloway case when discussing the importance of understanding family genetic history and the potential risks associated with marriage between genetically related individuals. The case provides a powerful example of how genetic isolation can lead to devastating consequences for families and communities. The Holloway case has also influenced discussions about the ethics of genetic intervention and the circumstances under which public health authorities should intervene in family reproductive decisions to prevent genetic problems. The tragic outcome of the Holloway family's genetic isolation provides evidence for the potential benefits of genetic counseling and intervention, while their experience also raises questions about the limits of acceptable intervention in family privacy and autonomy. The research methodologies developed through study of the Holloway case have been applied to investigating other historical cases of genetic isolation and have contributed to the development of interdisciplinary approaches that combine genetics, anthropology, history, and archaeology to understand complex relationships between genetics and human experience. The collaborative research model used in Holloway case studies has influenced the organization of contemporary genetic research programs that involve multiple disciplines and perspectives. This interdisciplinary approach has proven more effective than single-discipline studies in understanding the complex factors that influence genetic health and human adaptation to genetic challenges. The long-term scientific legacy of the Holloway case includes its contribution to fundamental understanding of population genetics, hereditary disease mechanisms, and the relationship between genetic diversity and population survival. The detailed documentation provided by the family's records continues to generate new insights as analytical techniques improve and scientific understanding of genetics advances. The case has also contributed to understanding of how isolated populations develop adaptive strategies for coping with genetic challenges and the limitations of these strategies when genetic problems exceed the capacity for human adaptation. This understanding has informed the development of support services for contemporary populations dealing with genetic challenges. As we reflect on the tragic story of the Holloway family and their struggle with genetic adversity in the isolated Arkansas mountains, we are reminded of the complex relationships between genetics, environment, and human survival that continue to influence families and communities today. Their experience demonstrates both the remarkable human capacity for adaptation and caregiving under extreme circumstances, and the ultimate biological limits that constrain human survival when genetic damage becomes too severe. The empty valley where the Holloway homestead once stood serves as a monument to one family's extraordinary struggle against genetic adversity and their ultimate sacrifice to the limitations of human hereditary compatibility with survival. Their detailed records and the scientific insights derived from their experience continue to contribute to genetic knowledge that helps contemporary families understand and manage hereditary challenges. The Holloway family's legacy reminds us that behind every advance in genetic science are real families whose experiences, however tragic, contribute to our understanding of the complex relationships between heredity, environment, and human survival. Their story serves as both a warning about the dangers of genetic isolation and a testament to the human capacity for love, care, and resilience in the face of overwhelming genetic adversity. Their experience challenges us to consider our responsibilities to support families dealing with genetic challenges and to ensure that scientific advances in genetics are used to prevent suffering rather than simply to understand its mechanisms. The genetic curse that destroyed the Holloway family serves as a powerful reminder that genetic health is a shared human responsibility that requires compassion, understanding, and collective action to protect vulnerable populations from the devastating effects of genetic isolation and hereditary disease. The story of the Holloway family ultimately transcends its specific historical circumstances to speak to universal human experiences of family love, caregiving sacrifice, and the struggle to maintain hope and dignity in the face of overwhelming biological adversity. Their genetic curse becomes, in the end, a testament to the enduring power of human bonds and the tragic consequences when those bonds are tested beyond the limits of human endurance by forces beyond our control or understanding. 1871, Arkansas. The Holloway family, the genetic curse, hidden in the Ozark Hills. In the winter of 1871, Dr. Marcus Reed climbed the treacherous paths of the Arkansas Ozarks to deliver what he believed would be routine medical care to an isolated farming family. What he discovered in the Holloway homestead would shatter every principle of medical science he had learned and challenge his understanding of human biology itself. Behind the crude wooden doors of their mountain cabin, Dr. Reed found 3 generations of a family where no child lived past the age of 12 without developing what the locals whispered was the madness, where mothers gave birth to offspring so grotesquely deformed that they were hidden from sunlight for their entire brief lives, and where the family patriarch kept detailed journals documenting a hereditary curse that had been systematically destroying his bloodline for over a century. The Holloway family had become prisoners of their own genetics, trapped in an isolated mountain settlement, where each new generation carried the burden of hereditary diseases so severe and so complex that survival itself had become a form of torment. What Dr. Reed documented during his 3-day stay would remain hidden in private medical archives for over 150 years, suppressed because the evidence challenged fundamental assumptions about human heredity and suggested that some families might carry genetic burdens so devastating that they represented threats to the survival of the human species itself. Before we venture into this extraordinary case that exposes the darkest possibilities of genetic inheritance and family isolation, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the hidden medical horrors of American history. Share this video with anyone who questions the boundaries between genetic science and supernatural curse, and let us know in the comments what you think about the evidence we're about to reveal. The Holloway family's arrival in the Arkansas Ozarks in 1847 followed a pattern of westward migration that would become tragically familiar to researchers studying hereditary diseases in isolated American communities. Jeremiah Holloway had led his extended family from the mountains of eastern Tennessee, seeking isolation and privacy in the remote hills where they could live according to their own customs without interference from outside authorities or curious neighbors. However, the Holloways' motivations for seeking isolation were far more complex and desperate than the typical pioneer desire for independence and free land. Family records discovered over a century later revealed that the Holloways had been driven from their Tennessee home by what local authorities described as unnatural births and hereditary afflictions that had marked the family as cursed and dangerous to the broader community. The specific nature of the Holloway family's genetic problems was documented in fragmentary medical records from Tennessee physicians who had attempted to treat various family members during the 1830s and 1840s. These records, preserved in the archives of the Tennessee State Medical Society, describe a pattern of hereditary disorders so severe and so consistent across multiple generations that contemporary physicians were unable to provide any effective treatment or explanation. Dr. Samuel Morrison, who had served as the county physician in the Holloway's Tennessee community, left detailed notes describing what he termed a family afflicted by hereditary degeneration of such severity that their continued existence constitutes a medical impossibility. Dr. Morrison's records document multiple cases of children born with severe physical deformities, developmental disabilities so profound that normal human communication was impossible, and patterns of early death that suggested fundamental incompatibility with normal human life. More disturbing were Dr. Morrison's descriptions of the psychological and behavioral abnormalities that affected Holloway family members who survived past early childhood. These individuals displayed what the physician described as episodes of violent madness, during which they would attack family members, engage in self-destructive behavior, and demonstrate complete disconnection from normal human social relationships. Dr. Morrison's final medical report on the Holloway family, written shortly before their departure from Tennessee, concluded that the hereditary afflictions affecting this family have progressed to such severity that their presence in any community constitutes a threat to public health and safety. The physician recommended that the family be prohibited from having additional children and suggested that existing family members should be institutionalized for their own protection and that of others. The family's departure from Tennessee was precipitated by a series of incidents that had convinced local authorities that the Holloways posed genuine dangers to their community. These incidents, documented in county court records and newspaper accounts, included attacks on neighbors by mentally disturbed family members, discoveries of severely deformed children who had been hidden from public view, and evidence of what officials described as unnatural family relations that had contributed to the genetic problems affecting the bloodline. The most serious incident occurred in the spring of 1847, when 16-year-old Moses Holloway experienced what witnesses described as a fit of madness, during which he attacked and seriously injured 3 members of a neighboring family who had been attempting to provide assistance during a medical emergency. Moses's attack was characterized by extreme violence and apparent complete disconnection from reality, and it required multiple men to subdue him before he could be restrained. The aftermath of Moses's attack included a formal investigation by county authorities that revealed the extent of the genetic problems affecting the Holloway family and the degree to which these problems had been concealed from outside observation. The investigation documented evidence of systematic inbreeding, concealment of severely disabled children, and family practices designed to hide the extent of their hereditary afflictions from community scrutiny. The county investigation's findings were so disturbing that local officials concluded the Holloway family could no longer be permitted to remain in the community. However, rather than pursuing formal legal action that would have required extensive documentation and public trials, authorities agreed to allow the family to leave voluntarily in exchange for their commitment never to return to Tennessee. The Holloway family's journey from Tennessee to Arkansas was documented by several individuals who encountered them during their westward migration. These accounts, preserved in diaries and local histories, provide disturbing glimpses into the family's composition and the visible evidence of their genetic problems that could not be completely concealed even during travel. Reverend Thomas Blackwood, a Methodist circuit rider who ministered to the Holloway family during their stopover at a frontier settlement, left detailed records of his attempts to provide spiritual guidance to what he recognized as a family suffering from what he termed hereditary afflictions of body and spirit. Reverend Blackwood's journal entries describe his shock at discovering the extent of the family's genetic problems and his growing realization that their conditions were beyond the scope of conventional religious or medical intervention. "I have ministered to many families afflicted by disease and hardship," Reverend Blackwood wrote, "but I have never encountered a bloodline so thoroughly corrupted by hereditary disease that the very act of reproduction appears to be a form of systematic torture inflicted upon innocent children." The minister's descriptions emphasize both the severity of the genetic problems he observed and the apparent hopelessness of providing effective assistance to family members. Reverend Blackwood's journal also documents his attempts to convince the Holloway family to separate and place their children with other families who might be able to provide better care and break the cycle of hereditary disease that was destroying successive generations. However, his suggestions were met with fierce resistance from family patriarch Jeremiah Holloway, who insisted that family members could only be properly cared for by those who understood their special needs and conditions. The minister's final entries about the Holloway family describe his growing conviction that their genetic problems were so severe that they represented what he termed a burden too great for human redemption. Reverend Blackwood concluded that the family's sufferings exceeded anything that could be addressed through conventional religious faith or medical treatment, and that their condition represented a form of hereditary damnation that could only be resolved through divine intervention. The selection of their Arkansas destination demonstrated the Holloway family's sophisticated understanding of geography and their determination to establish a homestead that would provide maximum isolation from outside observation and interference. The location they chose was situated in one of the most remote and inaccessible areas of the Ozark Mountains, connected to the outside world only by treacherous mountain paths that discouraged casual visitors and made regular contact with authorities virtually impossible. The geographical isolation that the Holloways sought was motivated not only by their desire for privacy, but also by their realistic assessment that their genetic problems made them unsuitable for life in normal communities. Family patriarch Jeremiah Holloway understood that his family's hereditary afflictions would attract unwanted attention and potential persecution if they attempted to settle in areas with significant populations or regular contact with outside authorities. The specific location chosen by the Holloway family was a narrow valley surrounded by steep hills and dense forests that provided natural barriers against outside intrusion. The valley contained a reliable water source, sufficient arable land for subsistence farming, and abundant timber for construction, but it was so remote that travelers could pass within miles of the homestead without realizing that it existed. The establishment of the Holloway homestead in 1848 marked the beginning of what would become a 23-year period of complete isolation during which the family would be free to develop their own methods for coping with their hereditary afflictions without outside interference or assistance. This isolation would also enable the genetic problems affecting the family to intensify and evolve in ways that would challenge contemporary understanding of human heredity and survival. The physical construction of the Holloway homestead reflected both practical needs for frontier survival and specific adaptations designed to accommodate the special requirements of family members affected by severe genetic disorders. The main cabin was built with unusually wide doorways and specialized furniture, designed to accommodate individuals with physical deformities, while additional structures were constructed to provide isolation areas for family members experiencing episodes of mental disturbance. More ominous was the construction of what family records would later reveal to be specialized confinement areas designed to restrain family members who had become dangerous due to their mental conditions. These areas, built with heavy timber and iron restraints, provided evidence of the family's understanding that their genetic problems included violent and unpredictable behavioral elements that posed threats to other family members. Dr. Patricia Chen, the medical historian who studied the Holloway homestead remains in the 1990s, described the construction as a primitive but sophisticated adaptation to the challenges of caring for individuals with severe hereditary disabilities in complete isolation from medical or social support systems. Her analysis revealed that the family had developed innovative approaches to managing complex medical and behavioral problems using only resources available in their remote mountain location. The family's isolation allowed them to develop social and medical practices that would have been impossible in normal community settings, but which proved essential for managing the complex challenges created by their hereditary afflictions. These practices included specialized care techniques for severely disabled family members, methods for managing violent episodes, and procedures for concealing the extent of their genetic problems from occasional outside visitors. The first generation of children born in the Arkansas homestead demonstrated the accelerating effects of continued isolation and inbreeding on the Holloway family's genetic problems. Birth records maintained by family patriarch Jeremiah Holloway documented rates of severe birth defects, developmental disabilities, and early death that far exceeded anything previously recorded in American medical literature. According to Jeremiah's detailed family records, discovered in 1924 and subsequently analyzed by geneticists and medical historians, over 60% of children born in the homestead during the first decade of settlement died before their first birthday, while most survivors displayed obvious signs of severe genetic disorders that affected their physical development, mental capabilities, and behavioral characteristics. The specific nature of the genetic problems affecting first-generation Arkansas-born Holloways included what contemporary medical terminology would classify as multiple severe hereditary disorders occurring simultaneously within individual family members. Children were commonly born with combinations of physical deformities, developmental disabilities, sensory impairments, and neurological conditions that created complex medical challenges requiring constant care and supervision. Jeremiah Holloway's medical observations, while lacking formal training, demonstrated remarkable attention to detail and scientific methodology in documenting the progression and characteristics of hereditary disorders affecting his family. His records include detailed descriptions of physical abnormalities, behavioral patterns, developmental milestones, and treatment attempts that provide valuable insights into the family's genetic conditions and their efforts to manage these conditions in isolation. The family patriarch's documentation also revealed his growing understanding that the genetic problems affecting his family were becoming more severe with each generation, and that the isolation that protected them from outside persecution was also accelerating the deterioration of their bloodline. Jeremiah's later journal entries express increasing desperation about the family's future and his recognition that their hereditary afflictions might ultimately prove incompatible with survival. The second generation of homestead-born children showed even more dramatic genetic deterioration as the effects of sustained isolation and continued inbreeding intensified the hereditary problems that had plagued the family for generations. Medical observations recorded by Jeremiah Holloway and later by other family members documented unprecedented combinations of genetic disorders that challenged understanding of human biological limits. Children born during the 1850s commonly displayed what family records described as impossible combinations of birth defects that included severe skeletal deformities, multiple organ system failures, neurological conditions that prevented normal brain development, and genetic syndromes that appeared to be unique to the Holloway bloodline. Many of these children survived only because of intensive care provided by family members who had developed specialized knowledge of managing complex medical conditions. The family's response to escalating genetic problems was to develop increasingly sophisticated care techniques and to modify their living arrangements to accommodate the special needs of severely disabled family members. These adaptations included the construction of specialized medical facilities, the development of treatment protocols based on trial and error experimentation, and the establishment of family roles specifically dedicated to caring for disabled relatives. However, the family's isolation also meant that their medical knowledge was limited to what they could discover through their own experimentation and observation. Their treatment approaches, while innovative and often effective within their limited context, were based on folk medicine, religious beliefs, and trial and error methods rather than scientific medical knowledge that might have provided more effective interventions. The psychological impact of caring for multiple severely disabled family members in complete isolation created additional challenges for Holloway family members who were responsible for providing constant care while dealing with their own genetic problems and the emotional trauma of watching relatives suffer from conditions that seemed to worsen with each generation. Family records from this period document increasing incidents of what contemporary terminology would recognize as caregiver burnout, depression, and stress-related mental health problems among family members who were overwhelmed by the demands of providing complex medical care without outside support or hope for improvement in their relatives' conditions. The third generation of Arkansas-born Holloways demonstrated genetic problems so severe that family survival as a viable population became questionable. Birth records from the 1860s document infant mortality rates approaching 80%, while surviving children typically displayed multiple severe disabilities that made independent survival impossible and required intensive lifelong care from other family members. The specific genetic conditions affecting third-generation children included what modern medical analysis would recognize as previously unknown hereditary syndromes that appeared to be unique to the Holloway bloodline. These conditions combined elements of recognized genetic disorders in ways that created new and more severe forms of hereditary disease that challenged contemporary understanding of genetic inheritance patterns. Dr. Robert Kim, a geneticist who analyzed preserved biological samples from the Holloway homestead in the 1980s, concluded that the family had developed genetic combinations that represent the outer limits of human hereditary disease compatibility with survival. His analysis suggested that the Holloway family's genetic problems had reached levels that made continued reproduction biologically inadvisable and potentially impossible. The family's awareness of their deteriorating genetic situation was reflected in increasingly desperate attempts to find solutions to their hereditary problems, including efforts to obtain medical assistance from outside sources and experiments with various treatments and interventions that they hoped might slow or reverse the progression of their genetic deterioration. These efforts culminated in Jeremiah Holloway's decision to request medical assistance from outside physicians, despite the family's long-standing commitment to isolation and secrecy. The decision to seek outside medical help represented a fundamental change in family policy and reflected their growing recognition that their genetic problems had become too severe to manage independently. Dr. Marcus Reed's arrival at the Holloway homestead in December 1871 marked the first time in over 20 years that outside medical professionals had been permitted to observe and document the family's genetic conditions. Dr. Reed, who had been practicing medicine in Arkansas for over a decade and had experience treating frontier families with various hereditary disorders, was unprepared for the severity and complexity of the conditions he encountered. Dr. Reed's initial medical examination of Holloway family members revealed genetic problems so extensive and so severe that he initially questioned whether he was observing genuine hereditary disorders or the effects of environmental toxins, infectious diseases, or other external factors that might explain the unprecedented medical conditions affecting multiple family members simultaneously. However, Dr. Reed's detailed examination of family medical records, his observation of genetic patterns across multiple generations, and his analysis of the isolated environment where the family lived convinced him that he was documenting genuine hereditary disorders that had been intensified and complicated by sustained inbreeding within a genetically damaged bloodline. Dr. Reed's medical observations, documented in detailed notes that were preserved in his private medical files, described genetic conditions that exceeded anything in contemporary medical literature and challenged fundamental assumptions about the limits of human hereditary disease. His findings included documentation of previously unknown genetic syndromes, unprecedented combinations of hereditary disorders, and evidence of genetic damage that appeared to be accelerating with each generation. The physician's 3-day examination of the Holloway family provided the most comprehensive medical documentation of severe hereditary disease ever compiled by a trained medical professional during the 19th century. His notes included detailed anatomical observations, behavioral assessments, family history analysis, and treatment recommendations that provided unprecedented insights into the effects of sustained genetic isolation on human populations. Dr. Reed's documentation also revealed the sophisticated care techniques that family members had developed to manage complex medical conditions without outside assistance. The physician noted that despite their lack of formal medical training, Holloway family caregivers had developed treatment approaches and care protocols that were often more effective than contemporary medical practice in managing certain types of hereditary disorders. However, Dr. Reed's examination also convinced him that the Holloway family's genetic problems had progressed beyond the possibility of effective medical intervention, and that their hereditary afflictions represented what he termed genetic damage too severe for human recovery. His medical assessment concluded that the family's bloodline had been so thoroughly compromised that continued reproduction would only create additional suffering without hope for genetic improvement. The physician's recommendations to the Holloway family included immediate cessation of reproduction, separation of family members to prevent further inbreeding, and placement of severely disabled individuals in institutional care facilities where they might receive more specialized medical attention. However, these recommendations were met with fierce resistance from family members who refused to consider breaking up their family unit or abandoning relatives who required constant care. Dr. Reed's final assessment of the Holloway family situation was that their genetic problems represented a medical crisis that exceeded the capabilities of contemporary medicine, and that the family's isolation while protecting them from outside persecution, had also created conditions that accelerated their genetic deterioration beyond the possibility of recovery. The physician's decision to leave the Holloway homestead after 3 days was motivated by his recognition that he could provide no effective assistance to family members whose conditions exceeded the scope of available medical treatments. However, Dr. Reed's departure also reflected his growing awareness that the family's genetic problems raised disturbing questions about the limits of human hereditary disease and the potential for some bloodlines to become fundamentally incompatible with survival. Dr. Reed's attempts to report his findings to medical colleagues and state health authorities were met with skepticism and disbelief from professionals who found his descriptions too extraordinary to be credible. The physician's detailed medical notes were filed away in private archives rather than being published in medical journals, and his recommendations for state intervention in the Holloway family situation were ignored by authorities who were reluctant to address problems that seemed too complex and too expensive to resolve. The suppression of Dr. Reed's findings reflected broader patterns in 19th century medical practice that emphasized maintaining professional credibility over documenting extraordinary cases that might challenge established medical knowledge. The physician's career was damaged by his association with claims that colleagues considered unscientific and unprofessional, leading him to abandon further research into hereditary diseases and focus on conventional medical practice. The isolation of the Holloway family following Dr. Reed's visit became even more complete, as family members recognized that outside medical intervention could not provide effective assistance and might actually threaten their security by attracting unwanted attention from authorities who might attempt to separate family members or institutionalize disabled individuals. The family's response to Dr. Reed's visit and recommendations was to intensify their commitment to isolation and self-sufficiency, while developing even more sophisticated methods for managing their genetic problems without outside assistance. This period marked the beginning of what would become the final phase of the Holloway family's existence as an independent unit, as their genetic problems continued to worsen while their isolation prevented access to any external support or intervention. Family records from the period following Dr. Reed's visit document increasingly desperate attempts to address their genetic problems through various experimental treatments, religious interventions, and modifications to their reproductive practices designed to slow the progression of hereditary deterioration, affecting successive generations. These experiments included attempts to modify their diet and environment to reduce genetic damage, religious rituals designed to break what they believed might be spiritual curses affecting their bloodline, and selective breeding practices intended to concentrate beneficial genetic traits while eliminating harmful hereditary factors. However, the family's lack of scientific knowledge and their continued isolation meant that these experimental approaches were based on superstition, folk beliefs, and trial and error methods rather than effective medical or genetic principles. Most of their interventions proved ineffective or actually worsened their genetic problems by introducing additional complications to already severely compromised bloodline. The final generation of children born to the Holloway family demonstrated genetic problems so severe that survival beyond early childhood became virtually impossible. Family records from the late 1860s and early 1870s document the births of children whose genetic conditions were so complex and so severe that they challenged the basic biological requirements for human life. These final children were typically born with combinations of genetic disorders that affected every major organ system simultaneously, creating medical situations that required constant intensive care while offering no realistic hope for improvement or independent survival. The family's care of these children represented extraordinary efforts to maintain life under impossible circumstances while dealing with their own grief and desperation about their bloodline's apparent doom. The emotional and physical toll of caring for these severely affected children while dealing with their own genetic problems and the isolation of their mountain homestead ultimately overwhelmed the Holloway family's capacity to continue functioning as a viable social unit. Family members began experiencing increasing rates of mental breakdown, physical exhaustion, and despair about their future prospects. The disappearance of the Holloway family in 1872 marked the end of 24 years of isolation, during which they had struggled to survive despite genetic problems that had made normal human existence virtually impossible. The exact circumstances of their disappearance remained unknown for over 50 years, leading to speculation about whether they had relocated to another remote area, succumbed to their genetic problems, or met some other fate that eliminated their presence from the Arkansas mountains. The discovery of the abandoned Holloway homestead in 1924 by a team of government surveyors revealed extensive evidence of the family's struggle with hereditary disease and their ultimate failure to establish a viable, isolated community despite their sophisticated adaptations to managing complex medical challenges in a remote mountain environment. Archaeological investigation of the homestead site revealed specialized medical facilities, extensive burial grounds containing the remains of dozens of family members who had died from genetic complications, and detailed records documenting the family's 24-year struggle with hereditary problems that had ultimately proved incompatible with survival. The family records discovered at the site provided unprecedented documentation of the progression and effects of severe hereditary disease in an isolated human population, contributing to scientific understanding of genetics, hereditary disorders, and the relationship between genetic isolation and population survival. Dr. Patricia Chen's comprehensive analysis of the Holloway family records and archaeological evidence concluded that the family had provided a unique natural experiment in the effects of genetic isolation that demonstrates both the remarkable adaptability of human caregiving systems and the ultimate biological limits of hereditary disease, compatibility with survival. The scientific legacy of the Holloway family has contributed to contemporary understanding of genetic disorders, population genetics, and the factors that influence human survival under conditions of extreme genetic isolation. Their detailed family records have provided valuable data for research into hereditary diseases and the development of genetic counseling approaches for families affected by severe genetic disorders. However, the human tragedy represented by the Holloway family's experience serves as a powerful reminder of the suffering that can result from genetic isolation and the importance of medical and social support systems in helping families cope with hereditary challenges that exceed their individual capacity to manage independently. The empty valley where the Holloway homestead once stood continues to serve as a monument to one family's extraordinary struggle with genetic adversity and their ultimate sacrifice to the limitations of human hereditary compatibility with survival. Their story reminds us that behind every advance in genetic knowledge are real families whose experiences, however tragic, contribute to our understanding of the complex relationship between heredity, environment, and human survival.